Up to this point, we've been talking about storytelling in largely abstract terms of character, goals, stakes, obstacles, and so on. This time I want to talk about it in much more concrete terms, in terms of building an actual story, or what we refer to as plotting. In order to do that, we need to go back to some fundamentals and talk about what a story needs, what is required for a story. First and foremost, maybe, is a character or characters. And characters are the prime movers of the stories, but they're also the vessels of meaning, which is to say they're the ones that things are happening to and the ones that are making things happen, but they're also the kind of point of identification for us where we say that this matters to me because, right? Because it happens to this character, because it happens to human beings generally, etc., etc. The second are, broadly speaking, goals or stakes or whatever is in jeopardy in a story. And we talked about these things separately, but here I want to look at them somewhat collectively as the impetus that makes a story move forward. We're headed toward a particular goal. There is something at stake. There is something in danger, and it forces our characters to act, to do something. The impediments to that action or that forward motion we refer to as obstacles, and these things often define the fourth element, which is change, because when the characters approach an obstacle, as we talked about in the last lecture, they're forced to adapt in some way. And I think of this in sort of existential terms as moving from being, which is to say simply existing in the world, to becoming the character that they're supposed to become over the course of the story. In a typical hero narrative, for example, to achieve self-actualization or to grow into their quote-unquote better self. But there are also some slightly more esoteric qualities of a story that are essentially required for it to work. The first of them is an idea we've been talking about for the past several weeks, which is the theme, which is broadly understood as what the story is about or the underlying human question that it is dealing with. Sometimes we think of the theme in relation to the meaning of the story. What's it all about in that larger kind of human sense of the term. But the about in this case is a way of kind of creating continuity, of saying this is what connects one element of the story to the other and why they exist in some meaningful relationship to each other. And those themes can vary very broadly. They can be something like the theme of self-actualization in a hero narrative where the character is becoming their better self. Or it can be a theme like, the universal pull of love or, interplanetary strife or something like that. It's whatever it is that ties all elements of the story together and allows us to think of it as asking some question that is important in one way or another. The second of these is inevitability. When you think about the way you experience a story, inevitability and the third item, which are surprise, actually work hand in hand. That once we get to the end of the story or to the point where it meaningfully resolves, we think of all of that has come before it as being necessary rather than arbitrary. How we got here matters. The story seems inevitable in the sense that, of course, all of those circumstances would have led to this resolution or this solution. That's just an impression we take away from a story. Of course, it's possible to write a story in many, many other ways and make it seem inevitable when we get wherever we're going. But the way that we experience it in that moment, it must feel as though all those elements are necessary. But before we get there, we must wonder where we are headed, and this is where surprise comes in, that we're constantly in a good story, as opposed to a poor one, which is constantly telegraphing where it's going. We're often left to scratch our head and wonder what's going to come next. This isn't just true in things like a thriller or a suspense narrative. It can be true in something relatively small and remote, where we're simply watching a character pursue a train of thought. If it moves in a direction which is obvious or cliched, it's a disappointment to us. We want to be surprised. We want to wonder what that character is capable of doing or thinking next. And that's an incredibly important value in plotting a story. In many ways, plot is just some basic building blocks of storytelling, which are relatively easy to understand. They are the events and the sequence of events within a story, or what Margaret Atwood refers to in Happy Endings as a what and a what and a what sequence, and the description of the actual thing. They're also the ways in which we identify in the story, right? Which is to say, how we connect ourselves to characters and establish sympathy. They are the motive. They are the meaning, right? They're the why and how in that Atwood story. So the plot tells us why things matter to a certain extent, because they're happening to people with whom we identify in one way or another. And then plot, of course, is just some sort of basic formal elements as well. We've talked about the inciting incident, which is the kind of initial choice that typically occurs right at the beginning of a story, or very near the beginning. The rising action of a story, which is often described as the second act, or the complication of the story, which is a series of discombobulations where there's more and more stuff sort of entering into the story that we have to account for as readers, and that the characters have to respond to in one way or another in order to find their way out of the story. To which comes an ultimate choice that we refer to as a complication, as not complication, as the climax of the story. And then the falling action, which is proceeded to a certain extent by the meaningful resolution of the story. In other words, it all comes together in some shape that makes sense to us and that seems important to us. When we are plotting a story, we need to be thinking about the relationship of those pieces, those basic elements or needs of the story, as well as the basic building blocks of the narrative. And we do that through the process of outlining generally. Some writers simply sit down and begin writing. I'm going to strongly suggest that you consider outlining your work as you go. Even if you're doing both of those things at the same time, it's very often useful to simply focus on an outline for a while and see what sort of story you have. And when you're outlining plots, there are two ways of doing this. There are more than two, but there are two that are most common. The first is to sort of think of it in the broadest terms of the three-act structure, or mapping out the narrative arc of the story. So you start with the setup, which introduces the characters and the inciting incident. There's usually some minor complications in this. You introduce subplots very typically. This is also referred to as the first act of the story, regardless of whether it is in a single act or not. It's that first section, that first piece of it. The second section we refer to as the complication, or the second act. This is where you introduce the major obstacles of the story. Very often there are reversals where you think the story or a character's story arc is going in a certain direction, and then it doubles back in some way. There are surprises that we meet along the way that the character is adjusting to as they come along. In other words, all of these things sort of complicate or confuse their experience in the reality of the story and force them to act in some kind of final way, which is the resolution of the story that begins with the climax. It's that moment where they make the ultimate choice. And then in the resolution of the story, we also see the plot points all sort of weaving together. If there's a main plot and subplots, for example, we see them connecting to each other. And in the resolution, we see the revelation of whatever we think of as the meaning of the story, which isn't to say that we have to say they all live happily ever after, or that there's an answer to it. But whatever questions the story raises, in some way the resolution of the story is going to address. So that's the three-act structure. We look at this broad narrative arc of the story. The second kind of more granular approach to outlining, and one that I'd like you all to work with if you can, is what's referred to as a step outline, or in screenwriting it's called a beat outline, where you take the basic beats of the story and the basic turns of the story, and you list them, usually simply as bullet points, and you can separate them according to three acts if you're kind of operating within that structure, or not, depending on what works for you. So the basic element of a step or a beat within this outline would be a single scene in the story, and you're describing what is happening in that scene. Now, the way that we identify something as being a scene is by thinking about whether there's some sort of shift that occurs in it. And the easiest way to think about this is a kind of shift in electrical charge, that it moves from positive to negative or negative to positive. We have a change in a character's attitude. We have a new piece of information that's brought in that complicates something, sometimes in a small way, sometimes in a big way. In other words, we have what we refer to as minor or major plot turns occurring in those scenes. So your story beats or your step outline are simply going to list all of those moments. And you can describe them as scenes, or you can describe them as beats or turns, whatever it is that works for you, so that you can actually see the dramatic progress of your story. You can see what actions are likely to occur in them. You can see where the characters are changing, and you can see where all of those things are headed in the direction of a meaningful resolution, which is finally where all plots land.